that's because of the pauses. It's not really like 10 slides. I have a strategy, which is that I just threw these slides together by copying and pasting different presentations that I've done. I have not been through this series of slides before, so we're all in it together, I think, is the way to look at this. So I just want to start off, oh dear, this is a bit more excitable than I expected. Okay, so I just want to start off by giving a small motivation for kind of poverty measurement. First of all, why is it something that's important and interesting, but also why is kind of rigorous technical analysis of it something useful as well. And then look very quickly at a bit of historical background as to how poverty has been measured in the past, and what are the kind of methodological developments that are happening more recently and at the moment. So then looking at those recent developments in kind of different dimensions, and then finally giving a little bit of a taste of my research, and I've done that by dumping in a whole presentation that I gave at a conference recently. So I won't go through that presentation, I'll just pick out a couple of hopefully interesting bits from it. So just thinking about the motivation for kind of measuring these things, I don't think I need to justify this to you guys in this room. We all know that measures or indicators are used to guide policy, and they may then end up having an impact on resource allocation. And what I want to focus on a bit more is thinking carefully about what these measures kind of embody. So then we're going to, if we're using any particular measure of something, it's embodying some assumptions, both about the information that's going into that measure, so we can think about the presentation that was it Jessica gave yesterday evening, but not just kind of worrying about the data quality, are we putting in the right data, are we putting in the appropriate data. What we then do with that data embodies certain ethical assumptions. So this is kind of maybe a fertile ground for doing research, to really kind of elucidate what's going on here. So one thing that worries me a lot is when we have an indicator that has a particular name or label attached to it, if you look at the information that's actually going into that indicator and the way that information is aggregated, perhaps that indicator measures nothing of the sort. So just some examples that I could discuss, but I don't have time to discuss. So our standard global $a-day poverty measure, thinking about the UK child poverty measure, which I'd argue is a very crude measure of inequality and not a measure of poverty at all. Thinking about the maternal mortality, kind of standard WHO way of measuring that. So a big discussion could be had on all of those, we won't do that. So what I'm really thinking about, does the measure do what it says it does? Does it measure what it says it does? I don't know what I'm doing with this thing here. Okay, so in terms of doing, what's an economist got to bring to this? Well, looking at the information that's going into these measures and maybe putting that into an analytical framework and thinking really quite fundamentally about the information content in the data and then the way that that data is going into the measure. But then also what I think is really, really interesting is thinking about the ethical principles that are embodied in the measure. Now, I'm not saying that as an economist, I have the right to decide what those ethical principles are. I think, that's a matter for politics, for society. There are other people that are actually going to, more cynically or less cynically, understand and know and analyse what's going on there. But there's a role as an analytical economist to actually make explicit those links. So, if the policymaker has certain principles, then you can present a menu of measures that would reflect those principles. Of course, in the real world, this might all be a bit too academic. So just very quickly looking at the history of poverty measurement, I must apologise, this is very Europe and UK centric because that's what I know most about. So I'm thinking about kind of far back in history when support for the destitute was not bureaucratised. So it's being provided by the family, by community, by local religious institutions, or quite possibly it's not being provided at all. And I think kind of looking ethically at various places in the world, including my own country, and looking at various times in history, we have a problem with, depending on your ethical principles. So I'm not saying that that was any good. Now thinking about what happened in Europe, oh dear, my pause is gone. So we started off with a non-bureaucratized kind of pattern, and then in the 16th and 17th centuries, this became increasingly kind of formalized and bureaucratized. So thinking about the particular pattern of evolution in the UK, it's all connected with the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII. So this was all to do with politics and his marriage to Anne Boleyn and so on and so forth, led to the Reformation having its own peculiar form in England. But the monasteries historically had provided a lot of the kind of support for the destitute. With the dissolution of the monasteries, there were social problems that arose. As a response to those social problems, what is called or known as the Old Poor Law, so it's a series of legislations over many decades, came into being, and basically that mandated the parishes of the new Church of England to have that role in caring for the destitute. Okay, so of course this is all then happening locally, and there's local taxation, and I'm sure there's loads of interesting research to be done on this, and I don't know anything really about the details, but we've got local taxation of the more wealthy. I mean, the church was extracting lots of rents from everybody anyway, and then some of that's going through in terms of supporting the poor. So that's mainly happening at a local level, but it's becoming more bureaucratic at that local level. But what's really interesting is that we start having information gathered in a fairly kind of systematic and bureaucratic form. And so that actually then ends up going up to a more national level. So William and Mary were joint monarchs of England round about 1700, glorious revolution time. So they were busy fighting wars, and they needed taxes. And this, the kind of the local information from the parishes, providing support for the destitute, was actually used to determine liability for this poll tax, which basically every adult male was expected to pay, except if you were in receipt of support from the parish or otherwise kind of marginal. And so I can't remember the exact details, but we've got this local parish level information that's then being used to determine the liability to taxation. So then we have the very first instance that I've been able to find of kind of aggregate poverty measurement, which happened on the basis of that information. So this guy called Gregory King, I think he somehow aggregated up all of this information that was being used for these taxes, and he found that 55% of the population of England and Wales were found to be insolvent. So they were excused from this tax, either because they were themselves in receipt of poor relief, or because they were kind of in that marginal category. Okay, next interesting thing to happen perhaps. In 1895, Charles Booth, who was one of these Victorian philanthropists, was very concerned with the state of society in London, and he commissioned these maps, which I'm sure lots of you have seen and heard of. If you haven't seen these maps, they're all available online, and it's absolutely fascinating to have a look at them. But you can see that they've effectively done a census of the whole of London, and then the colours, so you can see the streets on this map. I think it's just a little bit of Whitechapel. And then the colours, the dwellings are kind of shaded in different colours to represent the degree of wealth of the people living there. So these red people are middle class people, and then the kind of black and blue people are the absolutely destitute, the relatively poor, and so on and so forth. So this is utterly astonishing, the amount of work that went into compiling this information. Again, it's quite interesting to look at the kind of the bureaucratic structures that enabled that to take place. And I believe that Booth made use of the school board system. So towards the end of the 19th century in the UK, education was made compulsory and comprehensive. And so the bureaucratic structures that were set up in order to kind of oversee the school system, it was those structures that were used to gather this information. So we've got an absolutely comprehensive look at London. I can't remember off the top of my head the figures in terms of the kind of the total proportion of the population that was found to be poor, but it was pretty significant. I'm thinking 30%, but I might be completely misquoting it there. Okay, so a similar period, Benjamin Rowntree of the famous Rowntree sweet-making Quakers wanted to carry out a similar study, not in the metropolis, in the capital city, but in a more provincial town. So in York, he wanted to, he was interested in social conditions. He wanted to find out how many people were poor in York. What's interesting is that the proportion of the population turned out to be fairly similar to in London, But what's also very, very interesting is that he carried out, or on behalf of him, people carried out a complete census of every household in York. Now, thankfully, in the 1920s, statistics was invented, so we can do surveys and we don't have to use census data to do poverty measurement or other relevant measurement. If we look at all of these measures that we've looked at so far, the general approach is a head count. Of course, the Booth maps are wonderful in terms of the amount of detail that they show, kind of going between the absolute destitute or vicious, however he classed that, worst off class, all the way through to the most wealthy. But the basic information that's coming out of these studies is what proportion of the population are poor, what proportion are not poor. And then typically that will be done in terms of a poverty line, a threshold that's determined in terms of individual income. And this approach is still used kind of in various people's presentations. It will come up, it has come up, this idea of what is the poverty rate, what is the headcount rate of poverty. So of course it's being used for the World Bank, and then Millennium Development Goals, looking at halving the proportion of the world's population that's living on less than $1 a day, approximately. Okay, so what's happening and kind of conceptually and from an academic perspective towards the end of the 20th century, there's a recognition that there's a somewhat of a problem with measuring poverty in this way. So okay, this is interesting and relevant information, but Sen in particular started highlighting some issues in terms of distorting incentives for policymakers if we're measuring poverty in this way. So kind of giving us a bit of a notational framework. If we have a population of n people, let's say it's our sample or our population, I'm not going to worry about that distinction for now. So we've got x1, x2, etc., so we've got those individual incomes. So Sen kind of started off this much more rigorous analytical way of looking at what are we doing with this data. So how are we aggregating it? And he distinguished between two steps. So firstly, there's the identification of who in your sample is poor. So if we're just doing this in a very, very simple way, if we have the poverty line Z, we're just looking at are you less than Z, greater than Z in terms of income. And then, separately from that, how are we going to aggregate that information? So perhaps we no longer want to simply add up the number or take the proportion. We might want to do something different with that aggregation. And in particular, he was concerned about the fact that we've got a kind of step function coming in if we're just doing the headcount measure. And this is going to perhaps give policymakers an incentive, if they're trying to reduce the headcount measure of poverty, then the policymakers have an incentive to intervene and target policies towards the least poor of the poor, which ethically we might have a problem with. So he began to look at thinking about kind of what are the ethical principles, and then what does that tell us about how we want to measure poverty. The poverty measure that he came up with at that point had some slightly peculiar properties, so you very rarely see people using it anymore. So then this set off a literature, and we have various academics suggesting different poverty measures. Some of them had nice properties, some of them did not. The ones that we'll have all heard of, I'm sure, are the Foster-Greer-Thorbecke poverty measures, so introduced in 1984, a parameterized family, including the poverty gap measure and the poverty gap squared measure. And it's that poverty gap squared measure that's become kind of fairly standard in a lot of academic analysis because it has some nice properties. Now, I've done something to this, I don't know what. Oh no, it's okay. So thinking then about this more kind of technical analytical literature, so a paper that I really, really like is by Foster and Shorrocks, written in 1991. And they wanted to find the entire class of measures that had certain appealing properties. So it turns out that that entire class of measures will have this fairly straightforward functional form. So I hope that I'm not going to throw too much notation, like mathematical notation at you, but you'll see that here we're just simply adding up, so we're making this linear combination, simply adding up over each of the individuals some function of their level of income. And then we might want to, we're kind of going to normalize it, so we'll just divide by that population. And what properties do we need this function to have? Well, it should be non-increasing and 0 above the poverty line and continuous except perhaps at the poverty line. So this is the same class of measures. And so what else are we going to introduce? If this phi function is decreasing below the poverty line, then the poverty measure will have the property of monotonicity. So that basically, if any person becomes more poor and nothing changes for anybody else, then the total amount of poverty in the population responds in the way you want it to. It actually falls. Sorry, it increases. And then it transfers, so then we're looking at inequality amongst the poor. So then we're saying that kind of greater depth of poverty is kind of even worse. So if we make a transfer of income from a more poor person to a less poor person, and they both stay poor, we've increased the inequality amongst the poor, and we think that that's worse, so we want the overall measure of poverty to increase. And so within this class of measures, that property is achieved by if the phi function is convex. Now what's interesting about this result is that I haven't told you the other regularity properties, but actually one of the most important ones that I'll come back to a bit later if we have time, which is about decomposability over subgroups. What's great is that this result, we know that any poverty measure that has that functional form has these nice properties. Vice versa, we know that any poverty measure that has the nice properties must have that functional form. So we've really tightly connected the set of properties that we like and the set of functional forms that are available. So we can make really clear statements, we can look at a poverty measure, immediately know, does it fall into this class, does it not fall into this class? Which means, does it have these properties, does it not have these properties? Because I'm more interested in the properties, looking at them as kind of ethical principles, than in the mathematics of what I'm doing with the data. Okay, so for example, the Foster-Greer-Thorbecke measures, they belong to this class, but they certainly don't exhaust it. And in a way, perhaps it's slightly arbitrary that we've ended up focusing on the poverty gap squared measure, but historical path dependence or whatever. Not necessarily much more exploration of this class of measures, because we've all decided we like the poverty gap squared measure, which has, this squaring introduces a very particular degree of kind of this transfer property amongst the poor, a very particular degree of aversion to inequality amongst the poor. Okay, so just thinking about those phi functions that we were just mentioning, if we are looking at simply the head count measure, so that's P0 in the class of measures, you have simply a step function. The poverty gap measure, so P1, alpha parameter is equal to 1. We've got that simple linear function for phi, and then a poverty gap squared, where it's a parabola kind of minimized there. So we're squaring the distance between z and 0. Okay, and if I had time, I would draw some graphs to illustrate the implicit trade-offs that are embodied in these measures in terms of this transfer between persons. I don't have time to sketch the graph, but simply to say, well, it's kind of irrelevant for the head count, that's just not taken into account at all. For the poverty gap measure, we're assuming perfect substitutability of income amongst the poor, whereas for the poverty gap squared measure, as I mentioned earlier, we're averse to that inequality, so we no longer have that perfect substitutability. Okay, so what's been going on more recently? So first of all, within this framework, so based on, well, so far I've been talking about income as our indicator for each individual. Of course, one of the fundamental things that we might start to challenge is that the appropriate domain on which to be measuring poverty in terms of the information that goes into our poverty measure? Because, of course, if we say that poverty is such and such, determined on the basis of a certain information, then we're saying that that information is exactly the information that's relevant for this concept called poverty. So maybe we don't necessarily think that individual or perhaps household incomes are necessarily the most appropriate domain on which to be measuring. So the first question is, well, instead of income, we might prefer to use consumption data. Why is that? Fundamentally, these x's, or the phi of x, comes down to effectively representing some kind of indicator of individual or household well-being. And of course, we all know that, to the extent possible, risk-averse people, I don't mean risk-averse people, I'm going to use the wrong terminology here, but people will try to insure against fluctuations. They'll try to smooth income over time, and I'm muddling up two concepts there, but I'm sure you can all unmuddle them for me. Rivalian, who's of course been very, very instrumental in kind of the whole World Bank global poverty measurement side of things, and very instrumental in what is a poverty line, how do you define it, how do you calculate it, the use of household survey data for doing all of this. So he has argued that actually if we have consumption expenditure data, that makes a lot more sense as in order to measure this individual well-being. So really that's what we should be putting into our poverty measures. What about, well, implicitly, I've been thinking about really household level data here, precisely because most of the surveys that we're able to use are household level surveys. But of course, there's a potential for considerable inequality within households. So ideally, we would really want individual level data in order to be able to pick up, because there might be disguised poverty, disguised inequality due to issues with intra-household allocations. And then just some recent things, people have been talking about extreme poverty rather than poverty. I'm not quite sure what I mean, it all comes down to how you define the poverty line and so on and so forth. So Sabina Alkai and James Foster are working on a paper at the moment, still within this Foster and Charlotte framework. So we've still got this kind of, this general functional form that I have at the top there. But, so these were the 5 functions I had before, but now we'll actually take our cutoffs at lower than Z. So we've introduced an extra set of discontinuities. So we're saying everybody below Z is poor, but we're only interested in measuring the amount of poverty amongst people below a certain lower cutoff. So that's one direction in which things are being extended. Oh, sorry again. So perhaps a more interesting avenue to explore is going beyond simply using kind of one real valued indicator for individual well-being. I don't necessarily want to say well-being as in we can measure something called well-being, but whatever that information is that's relevant at the individual level for saying, for kind of combining in order to determine poverty at the social level. So perhaps income would be fine, or consumption expenditure, once we've smoothed it as much as possible, if we lived in the world that we so wonderfully last week kind of disabused as the notion of it. So we don't have complete markets, we don't have perfect markets. The first fundamental theorem in its, in and of itself, in its basic form, does not apply. It tells us interesting things to explore, but the conclusion really is irrelevant. So maybe we really do need to start thinking about other indicators other than simply income or consumption expenditure. So I've just taken two examples here, health and education. They're going to be consumption partly determined by markets, but credit constraints and everything are going to come in. There's going to be non-market provision of these goods. It's going to vary a lot from place to place and time to time and so on. So if there are things that are relevant for poverty and well-being that are not going to be well represented by our income or consumption measures, then we'd want to start combining them into new measures. So we might take a dashboard approach like Millennium Development Goals and simply calculate kind of indicators for those different dimensions separately. Or we might try to start aggregating this. So the Human Poverty Index, which was included in the HDR, the Human Development Report, between 1997 and 2009, the idea was that you'd aggregate your health indicator, you'd aggregate your education indicator, you'd aggregate your standard of living indicator over the whole society, and then aggregate across those 3 dimensions. Alternatively, you can turn around that pattern of aggregation, and you need indicators at the individual level for whatever you want to put in, health, education, standard of living, all kinds of other things are possible, but you aggregate over those dimensions at the individual level first, and then you aggregate over society. If I had time, I might come on to kind of good theoretical reasons for why that really, really, really makes an awful lot more sense. So if we're thinking back to those simple ethical principles, very simple ethical principles we can use to say that these make a lot, this second approach makes a lot more sense than that approach. So we're going to keep that general functional form if we do that, but now we're taking a function of a vector of indicators, and should I be wrapping up? 5 minutes, okay. So of course we need detailed household surveys in order to do that. So for example, the multidimensional poverty index, which has superseded the human poverty index in the Human Development Report, uses data from the demographic and health surveys, chosen because it's fairly widely available for lots of developing countries and pretty comparable across different developing countries. So we've simply got, for each individual, a 0-1 function based on a weighted average of 0 ones saying, do you exceed some poverty threshold, or rather, do you fall below some poverty line, poverty threshold, for, I think, a total of 10 different indicators. So 2 health indicators, 2 education indicators, and 6 indicators of living standards. And they're weighted in a way such that we get a third weighting for these 3 kind of higher level divisions, and then, so of course, the individual weighting for the indicators is lower for those greater number of living standards indicators. So that's one way of aggregating the data. I would not necessarily argue that that's the best way, but that is certainly now beginning to take account of these different dimensions, perhaps in a rather arbitrary way, and perhaps there's more kind of scope for academic work to determine a less arbitrary way of combining that information in a way that really reflects, well, what do we mean by poverty? Kind of what are the implicit assumptions going on inside this? So another dimension, not looking over different dimensions of poverty, but looking then over the dimension of time and thinking about the concept of chronic poverty. So again here, you'd need a panel data survey, so longitudinal data, in order to follow the trajectories of individuals over time. Again, we can kind of pull these into the same kind of functional form, but of course now this XI is the trajectory of indicators over time for an individual or household. And there's lots of detail that I won't go into in terms of the different approaches to doing this, and there have been various suggestions made, and I think this is an area that I'm working in, so lots of suggestions have been made. The properties of these measures are being explored. There is some kind of very rigorous analyses that perhaps come up with measures that have slightly dodgy properties, and there are perhaps more attractive measures which have not been quite so rigorously analysed. So that's a field of kind of ongoing research at the moment. And there are some interesting trade-offs that go on there. So for example, if we want to measure chronicity of poverty, so when we're really thinking about persistence or extended duration over time, that actually turns out to fundamentally conflict with the idea of kind of depth of poverty and extreme poverty being worse and less easy to kind of substitute for or compensate for. So that's not necessarily immediately intuitively obvious, but those 2 ideas do conflict. And so perhaps that suggests that we need different sets of measures. We actually need to think about total poverty extended over time as a separate concept from chronic poverty and to combine the information there. And I was going to give you a little bit of a taste of some of the research that I've been doing, but I think we really don't have time. So let's just very quickly think about the analytical approach. So the idea is characterization, and as I described earlier, we're thinking about what are the ethical principles and exactly what class of measures kind of represent those ethical principles. So connecting those ideas very closely. And there's lots of kind of technical things that I've been worrying about. And lots of relevant literature, and I just want to show you three fundamental principles which apply across kind of everything that we've been talking about so far. So the idea of anonymity, so that individual identity should not matter in terms of the amount of kind of the way that individual contributes to the poverty measure. Also, subset consistency, which is very close to the idea of the subgroup decomposability that I briefly mentioned earlier in terms of that general functional form we saw. And simply representability, which is such that the ordering of poverty, if I say this society has more or less poverty than that society, that ordering can be represented by a real valued measure or function. So, so anonymity, we're just kind of shuffling around people, giving somebody's attributes to another person, but the overall distribution doesn't change. We would want our poverty measure to be invariant to that kind of sorting, reassorting. And then subset consistency, we are looking at consistency here. If we have poverty increasing, so if we have more poverty in society Z compared to society Y, but we've divided into 2 subsets, and the distribution of attributes has not changed in one of the subsets, but it has changed in the other, then regardless of that distribution in the unchanging subset, we would still expect to see that consistency in terms of saying that the Z society had more poverty than the Y society, regardless of what's going on in the unchanging subset. And then simply adding the final technical idea of representability, simply those three different principles enable us to say that our poverty measure must have this form, which looks an awful lot like, or if the poverty ordering must be representable by this kind of additive form, which looks a lot like the functional forms that we saw earlier. And so we could, and you don't want to see any of the proof, I don't think. So if we apply that to poverty measurement, then of course, if we take any kind of monotone transformation, we're preserving the same ordering, and we might want to think about the cardinal properties of the measure, or we might not. But so this will eventually come through. So we've connected those three very simple properties that I briefly introduced with a poverty measure in this very general form. Now, has that added a great deal to the literature? I'm not sure. This is the measure that we've basically, or the functional form of the measures that we've kind of coordinated on, and this is the consensus. But what the contribution is that if you actually look into the maths, we're no longer making any assumptions about the fact that we're using, say, a real valued indicator like income or consumption. We've actually extended much more. So now we can accommodate categorical indicators, such as going into the poverty, to the multidimensional poverty indices and so on. So it's just beginning to make this kind of contribution in terms of making rigorous the relationship between the ethical principles and then the classes of measures that kind of fit with those ethical principles. So that we can forget about the maths, and we don't have to tell the policymakers about the maths. We can simply say, these measures correspond to these principles, and if you want your measure to reflect these principles, these are the measures that you need to use. So I'm done, and I'm sorry I overran a bit.
We don't really have time, but if someone wants to, Natalie certainly can't answer everyone. If people want to ask one or two questions, they can just leave it and put it on the floor, throw out the questions. We discuss over dinner or whatever, drinks,
Yeah. Hi, Natalie. I would like to know more about how developing countries are adopting these new measurements, for example, the MPI, because the weights can still be decided with some degree of arbitrarity. And the next question would be if governments have some room to manipulate these weights and this data, or if there is like a centralized institution that is controlling and enforcing the use of some weights in order to preserve the comparability across countries.
UNDP is the one-word answer to that, but we can discuss it.
The question I'd like to throw out is there evidence of countries actually manipulating policies to lower their poverty count using the head count ratio?
Should we discuss later?
Yeah.
Again, discuss later, yeah.
As I said, let's throw out some questions over there. Unfortunately, we don't have time for Natalie to respond to them yet. Okay. Thanks a lot, Natalie.
All right, so continuing on the theme of measurement,